today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Another look at Matchroom's recent signee, young Tia Ayton. 18 years old. Interesting particulars in association with this young fighter is she comes from a mixed combat background. It's my understanding that she's got some kickboxing and Muay Thai experience. And what you often see from those fighters that transition into boxing is not only are they strong, but they've got a mean streak. They're quite aggressive. Which would explain why young Tia racked up so many knockouts in her amateur career, her amateur fights, of which she has 21 in the sport of boxing, choosing to forego trying out for the Olympic Games to instead go pro, and she'll be doing that with Matchroom very soon, campaigning in the women's super bantamweight division. Super bantamweight, that's where former Matchroom alum Ellie Scottney reigns as Unified Ring Magazine champion. That's where Yemi Mercado has the WBC, and newly crowned Mayeli Flores has the WBA. That's where Tia Ayton is set to campaign, though I don't get the sense that she's on a collision course with any of those fighters, those champions, because by the time young Tia is ready to fight for a full title, these fighters may have moved on. You have to remember that Ellie Scottney is set to be unifying titles with Yemi Mercado very soon on the undercard of Taylor vs. Serrano 3 in July. After that, whoever wins, and I think it's going to be Ellie, I'll assume that they're then going to target Mayeli Flores for Undisputed. That we could see an Undisputed champion crowned in this division very soon, after which the winner may move on, vacate all the titles they've won, at which point they'll be redistributed, and a new crop of champions will sprout, and young Tia Ayton could be one among them. That in the interim, she's going to garner professional experience, climb up the ranks, fight in the necessary eliminators, so that by the time she's ready to fight for a title, this entire line of champions would have changed. So they're not really on a collision course. Tia's got to fight in those 4-rounders, those 6-rounders, those 8, those 10-rounders. She can be as talented as she wants to be. She still needs experience, especially at only 18 years old. Plenty of it. For some weeks and some months now, there's been a sentiment expressed that perhaps Matchroom is not interested in promoting women anymore. A sentiment that was facilitated when they see Ellie Scottney and Alicia Baumgartner leave Matchroom for MVP. Matchroom isn't staging as many women's bouts as they used to, but I maintained that I don't think they're withdrawing from the women's game so much as revising their strategy, refining it, and revamping their stable of Valkyries. This would serve us as the proof. If they weren't interested in promoting women anymore, they wouldn't have signed Tia, let alone to a long-term promotional deal. Common sense. They wouldn't have signed Turkey's Elif Turnan. So what they're doing now is giving their stable a remodel, which is necessary. An update. And don't forget about what amateur standouts may emerge from the LA Games in 2028. I'm sure that Matchroom will be keeping an eye on that as well to see what female talent they want to bring on board. At this moment, what they're doing is updating their stable, and that's what I figured. In men's light heavyweight news, Callum Smith's formal request for mandatory title shot versus Dimitri Bivol has been denied by the WBO. The good news for Callum Smith is that he is free to next face the opponent of his choosing. The bad news is that it won't be against the fighter of his choice. Boxing Scene has confirmed that the WBO has denied a formal request filed by England's Smith to next face lineal WBA, IBF, and WBO light heavyweight champion Dimitri Bivol. Smith, a former WBA super middleweight champion from Liverpool, contended that his status as the interim WBO champion positioned him as the next mandatory in line for Bivol. That logic was acknowledged but dismissed for good cause. According to a 4-page ruling obtained by Boxing Scene, Wednesday's ruling will clear the way for Bivol to next face Artur Beterbiev in a rubber match tentatively slated for later this fall. Callum Smith, as WBO interim champion, maintains his status as the next in line for a mandatory defense. WBO Championships Committee Chairman Luis Batista Salas stated to all involved parties, however, per Section 1B.4, the committee is empowered to extend the period for discharging a mandatory defense with good cause. The committee finds that the anticipated Bivol Better Beef trilogy constitutes good cause to extend the mandatory defense period in the present circumstances. The committee hereby denies the request to order a mandatory defense by Dimitri Bivol against Callum Smith at this time. The WBO, like every other sanctioning body, so reserves the right to make their own decisions on their own terms, but they at least do it with a conscience. With good reason. They don't make decisions all willy-nilly like the World Boxing Council without justifiable cause, without an explanation. And that's what you get from the WBO that you don't get from everybody else. You get transparency. Callum Smith defeated previously unbeaten countryman Joshua Buatsi via a unanimous decision to win the interim WBO title. The bout took place on February 22nd this year on the undercard of Bivol's win over Artur Beterbiev in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Bivol avenged his lone career defeat, which came against Artur Beterbiev last October in Riyadh. That fight date was delayed by 5 months due to an injury sustained by Beterbiev. It opened the door for the WBO to approve a request for an interim title fight, won by Joshua Buatsi in a 12-round split decision win over Willie Hutchinson last September in London. Smith then claimed the secondary title in hopes that it would lead to a second crack at the light heavyweight crown. He previously suffered a 7th-round stoppage at the heavy hands of Artur Beterbiev in their lineal WBC, IBF, and WBO championship last January in Quebec, Canada. 2 wins have followed for Smith, including the above-mentioned thriller with Buatsi. Smith's point of contention for having his mandatory enforced is the relatively idle status of Germany's Michael Eifert, the leading IBF light heavyweight contender. The mandatory order rotation system is an established agreement set forth amongst the 4 internationally recognized sanctioning bodies, whereby the older mandatory must be discharged first, per the rotational sequence, argued Smith through Matchroom Boxing COO and General Counsel Sean Palmer. This protocol ensures an orderly progression of mandatory defenses whilst maintaining fairness across the respective organizations. Even under the assumption that the WBO mandatory is due, the IBF is next in line with the rotation system. Michael Eifert is the designated mandatory IBF challenger. However, the IBF has not enforced its mandatory status since 2021, and per our records and public knowledge, the IBF mandatory is next in line to be discharged. Callum Smith is the current WBO interim champion and the designated mandatory challenger. While factually correct, that status remains at the discretion of the sanctioning body. In this instance, the WBO believes its decision is for the greater good of the sport, which it is. It took years to get these 2 guys in the ring, so that when we finally did, we got 2 very competitive fights where both men won 1 apiece. This is the tiebreaker. This is necessary. The WBO mandatory defense obligation will be extended to accommodate the proposed Bivol Better Beef trilogy, noted the WBO. Callum Smith is authorized to engage in a voluntary defense of the interim title in accordance with WBO regulations. A similar and successful approach was taken by David Benavidez, who parlayed his interim WBC title status into an enforced mandatory title shot. The matter went all the way to a scheduled purse bid hearing before Bivol opted to instead vacate the WBC title, and I think that's what Callum was aiming for. Underneath it all, I don't think Callum did all of this with the hope that he would get Dimitri in the ring so much as one of Dimitri's belts, because he just saw David do it. The difference is the WBO is not going to skip ahead in the queue like the WBC did. The WBO are going to honor the rotation system, and they know they're not next in the rotation. The IBF is. Because if the whole world knows that Dimitri's fighting Artur again in the fall, why would Callum do this? It was a play to get the brown belt so that it could be on the line in the upcoming Anthony Yarde fight that is set to go down in Riyadh. The whole time they're petitioning the WBO, they were simultaneously negotiating a fight with Anthony Yarde. So you can't be angling for a Bivol fight if you're making a fight with Anthony Yarde. You did what you did knowing you wouldn't get Dimitri, but you could get one of his belts.
That's what they thought.
Callum Smith versus Anthony Yarde is officially on for August in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, according to Yarde's trainer, Tunde Ajayi, who confirmed to Boxing Scene that the deal was finalized earlier this year.
The fight was sealed in February, Ajayi said. All we needed to do was get past Lyndon Arthur, so there's no more ducking, talking bad about anybody. Let's fight. It's the only fight that makes sense.
Both fighters are coming off significant victories. Smith, 35, secured a points win over Joshua Buatsi, while Yarde, 33, avenged his earlier loss to Lyndon Arthur with a decision victory in their trilogy. These wins have positioned them as the top contenders in the UK light heavyweight scene. Ajayi emphasized the significance of this matchup, stating, "These are the only two names in the conversation now. Nobody else. I repeat, nobody else is in the conversation but Callum and Anthony, so let's do it. Let's go. August, Riyadh, it's on." With Smith holding the WBO interim title and Yarde climbing the WBO and WBA rankings, this bout is poised to determine the UK's top light heavyweight. The fight is expected to be part of a Matchroom versus Queensbury 5 versus 5 event, rekindling the competitive spirit between the two promotions.
You will recall that Matchroom got swept. They were 0-5 in the last one. Do they stand a better chance now that Callum will be representing them? And what does Callum have to do? I think he's got to tweak the strategy. He can't go about fighting Anthony the way that he just fought Joshua Buatsi. With Joshua Buatsi, he dominated the exchanges and dominated the pocket. With Anthony,
He's got to move around, use his jab, and set traps.
Anthony is better in the pocket than Joshua Buatsi, so you can't just sell out and trade with him as much as you did with Joshua. I also happen to think Anthony's a bit more heavy-handed.
The old saying goes, fight the boxer and box the fighter. Now, Joshua Buatsi is more of a boxer, whereas Anthony is more of a fighter. By turning it into a fight, a gunfight with Joshua Buatsi, you got him out of his comfort zone and forced him to fight at an accelerated pace that he's not used to. But if you try that with Anthony, well, he's right at home. That's what he wants, a gunfight.
You've got to keep this a boxing match and set him up, because Anthony Yarde, for all of his virtues, doesn't have the best defense.
He can be caught, and he has been caught by Sergey Kovalev years ago, who stopped him, and by Artur Beterbiev in more recent years, who also stopped him. Between Callum Smith's height and his length and his stopping power, he can score a stoppage, but he's got to tweak the strategy. This is a good fight.
But what this also means is that if Anthony and Callum are fighting each other, they're not fighting David Benavidez. It's what I told you.
Did you see what Tunde Ajayi said? Going into the Lyndon Arthur trilogy, they already knew that Callum Smith would be next. All they had to do was beat Lyndon, which means Anthony was never really an option for David Benavidez and his WBC email title.
You will remember that Jose Benavidez, David Benavidez's father, mentioned both Callum and Anthony. And what did I tell you? Those Brits make very good money all on their own, to where they don't have to come to America and bow down to David to make a check.
To make a living. In Saudi Arabia, they're likely to make more boxing each other than they would have made in America boxing David. I think the silver lining for David is that behind the scenes, something is happening, something is going on. Oscar De La Hoya posted this image to his Instagram stories yesterday. Golden Boy plus PBC ready to make history. Now, what fight could both Golden Boy Promotions and the PBC be working on amongst themselves? Zurdo Ramirez versus David Benavidez, does that ring a bell? And what have I been telling you? That all Zurdo has to do is beat the Cuban, and after that, I expect that he will fight David Benavidez. He will not fight Jai Opetaia in Saudi.
Jai might end up fighting Badu Jack.
But I was never really convinced that Oscar De La Hoya would sacrifice one of the few belt holders he has in his stable to one of Turki Al Sheikh's shows. He just doesn't have the bodies to spare. And he might rather put him in there with David. Put him in there with David Benavidez, who would be new to cruiserweight.
The fight would not require either fighter to travel. You can do it right here. You can do it in the United States, where Oscar
might have a bit more say-so working with the PBC than renting out his fighter to Turki Al Sheikh. Now, there are other fights that Golden Boy and the PBC could work on, like Virgil Ortiz versus Jesus Ramos. Virgil Ortiz versus the winner of Fundora versus Zoo. Virgil Ortiz versus Lara.
Arislandi Lara in the middleweight division. He still has that WBA title, but that's just me bouncing ideas around. That's just me speculating. What we know with an absolute certitude is that there has already been a dialogue for a Benavidez versus Zurdo Ramirez fight, and that was confirmed by Samson Lukowicz and Jose Benavidez, David's father,
which we've already talked about several times in several videos, that if nothing else, that's what the PBC and Golden Boy may be working on. A fight amongst themselves between David Benavidez and Zurdo Ramirez. Now, we've heard this and that from Samson Lukowicz about facing the winner of Bivol versus Better Beef on Cinco de Mayo weekend of the coming year, but I never bought into any of that talk because it's a presupposition that you would fight the winner of that fight on that date at a location of your choosing. You're assuming you get to call all the shots.
That might seem like a reasonable suggestion at first to the casual observer, but when you think about it, you're implying that the winner of that fight is going to fight you on your terms and not theirs.
And what that also implies is that you will have enough money to entice the winner of that fight to fight you on your side of things as opposed to Turkey's side. And I don't think for a second the PBC have more money than Turkey.
To make a long story short, it's all bullshit. And underneath it all, this is what I think they're planning. This is what I think they're working on. A Zurdo Ramirez fight. And all Zurdo has to do is hold up his end of the bargain on Jake Paul's undercard. He does that, I expect that he will fight David Benavidez shortly after.
Which isn't even a bad fight, by the way. It's not, but it's not a bigger scalp than facing the winner of Bivol versus Better Beef. And how bad did you want the winner of that fight if only 2 fights into your light heavyweight campaign, you're leaving?
This is what they were always gonna do, man.